Okay.
Karla, it's up to you to explain that everybody here more or less.
Yes, and I'm just starting to get to know you. So it's a pleasure to be here. This is a paper I've thought about for a very long time, and I'm finally getting it together, and I've talked about it a lot with Joe, so this is joint work. The purpose of this is to attempt to use what is now understood about cognitive science to shed new light on the process of social change. So this is a paper about cultural change producing economic change. It's in the spirit of work that's been done, that was done 50 years ago, but it draws on a whole new set of evidence and new kinds of evidence to make the story. Strange, it worked. So, a very fun book called Social Mindscapes conveys, I think, the central idea that I want to try to persuade you of. Society plays a major role in organizing our optical predispositions, how we view ourselves, how we view the world. If you're interested in agency theory, one way to think about the broad change in worldviews from the medieval period to today is there was a switch of authority from God as the principal to ourselves as the principal. That's a major change. If you read Shakespeare, they decide what's going to happen by looking at the sky. You know, this was a time when the medieval worldview was changing to the Renaissance, to a modern worldview. And we shouldn't take for granted that everybody has the worldviews that we do. In short, there's a missing variable, beliefs, perceptions that are all shaped by worldviews or what might be called mental models. And Gunnar Myrdal talked about it 50 years ago. He recognized that development economics would be greatly enriched by bringing in attitudes that he didn't call mental models or cognitive frames, but I really think he had that idea. Perceptual screens that determine how we view or understand a situation. You see, if we were rational actors and had unbounded attention and unbounded ability to process information, we wouldn't have filters or screens or limited models. We'd be able to absorb all raw data and analyze it under infinite sets of possible category systems and models. So the standard neoclassical framework doesn't have mental models and doesn't need them because we see the data, we evaluate it in an unbiased way, and we figure out all possible interpretations. I would like to meet such a man. In fact, most people I've met are trapped by their attitudes. They have certain notions that they take to be common sense, but that really aren't evaluated at all. The assignment of shame to certain kinds of work, for example, is very important in traditional societies. It changed, one of the big things that changed with the United States is the idea that work was honorable. Well, the Protestant Revolution obviously contributed to that. We're told in elementary school textbooks in America that when people came to the colonies and tried to say, oh, well, I don't need to work, I'm an aristocrat, someone else works, he's the commoner, then they were told, no work, no food. So this was a very different approach. Douglas North has picked up on this theme in his recent work, and in fact he argues that the fundamental driver of change is changes in mental models. This is his new view. Of course, he didn't always have this view. Our preoccupation with rational choice, thus he argues, has blinded us to the implications of subjective mental constructs by which individuals process information and arrive at conclusions that shape their choices. Where do the perceptions come from? Neoclassical theory skips this step. Then it goes on to say, when you're at the grocery store, you know, things aren't too complicated. Although actually they're becoming more and more complicated even at the grocery store. You know, what is organic food? But for most choices that are important in development, this idea is wildly incorrect. We make complicated choices in a world of incomplete information and subjective models used to interpret that incomplete information. So it's a very non-neoclassical world. A person in a developing country, first generation chance to get educated, first generation to move into the IT sector, he is not dealing with a full deck. His presuppositions about what makes for a good person, what makes for a good worker, what is a possibility of providing for his family, can make all the difference in what he does. So Myrtle and North argued that certain social constructions affect perceptions, judgments, and thus behavior, and might be part of a dysfunctional equilibrium. But they didn't really say how these constructs are created and evolve and collapse. And advances in behavioral economics and cognitive science have shed new light on this. So just to give you one example, there's a group centered at Yale Law School, all lawyers, who study cultural cognition. And they've done lots of work. And one example of their work studies climate change beliefs. There's a standard theory about why it is that there's disagreement on climate change. And it's a very neoclassical theory. The people who discount climate change are just uninformed. You have to just give them information. And under that theory, if you had more science literacy and numeracy, then you have a higher perception of the risk of climate change. That's a testable prediction. It's not borne out. Actually, the more scientifically literate and the more numerate people are, the lower on average in the United States the perceived risk of climate change is. And what's more important, that I didn't have a good picture for because it was just a little too complicated to explain, is that over here where I'm dealing with the highly educated people who understand questions about conditional probability and about vectors of disease, there's incredibly high variance here compared to here. And the reason there's high variance is that here there's political polarization. If you find out that someone's a Democrat versus a Republican, a liberal versus a conservative, you can basically predict how he's going to think about climate change. We not only have cultural screens, but we also have motivated cognition. We care to hold certain beliefs, and we certainly are very tribal about them. We want to hold beliefs that match our world. We want to fit in a world where other people believe in witches. I strongly recommend that you believe in witches too, or else you might find that you're the next witch on the block. And then you will actually come to believe in witches, or at least some functional equivalent of that. So I'm going to try to organize my presentation around 3 points. One is a set of examples, and this is really the motivation for this. I just kept coming across these examples where you've got big changes in outcomes, but none of the fundamentals changed. So Sam in his talk the other day had a starting model where you were up against nature. Though you were interacting with other people, at the end of the day, the real constraints were nature. How productive is your machine, for example? And neoclassical economics basically have that flavor. If you're going to get change, it has to be the technology changes or resources change or fundamental preferences change. We're going to get, although they're generally assumed never to change, we're going to have a series of examples where you get changes in outcomes that development economists really value, but you didn't change relative prices, you didn't change nature, you didn't change technology. So something else must be there. So I'm going to argue that the something else is a mental model. And then the second part of the talk is about how we have multiple mental models. So Joe just gave an example where the United States didn't allow capital liberalization. If you were in Kansas, you couldn't have banking in New York. The New York banks couldn't come to Kansas. At the same time, we have a mental model that justified capital flow restrictions in the US. We had a mental model that did support capital flow restrictions in the rest of the world. My favorite sociologist is this woman, Ann Swidler, who wrote a book called Talk of Love. And she interviews these people about their marriages or about their romantic relationships. And she finds that people simultaneously hold the view that, oh, this is an investment, I have to work on it, every day is a new day, I have to be nice to my spouse. And then the view, oh, there's just one person for me, and this is just right, and sort of it's God blessed, and somehow inevitable. And you can switch what mental model people use by cueing them in different ways. So we have mental models. The power of example can change them. That would be my first point. And the second is context is really important in activating a particular mental model. And then I'll have the world's simplest model of an equilibrium, which I'll use to explain the possibility that there's a cognitive basis for both societal rigidity and for rapid change. So part one. So here's the first example. In West Bengal, as in all of India, as I'm sure most people here know very well, there was a constitutional amendment. It provided for political reservations for women in village elections for Pradhan, village head. And this has been studied in a series of papers by Beeman, Esther Duflo, and others, almost all women. They find that exposure to women leaders eliminates men's prejudice against women leaders in evaluation. I mean, men still prefer men as leaders, but in evaluating whether a leader has done a good job or not, for example, in vignettes, they look at it in a number of ways. Exposure to just 7 years of women pradhans in an RCT eliminates the bias. So it suggests that we have these screens. Well, my favorite example of a screen is Nelson Mandela in his autobiography talks about how after the end of apartheid he got on a plane and for the first time in his life he saw a black pilot. He was really worried because you see, we think not like rational actors in the neoclassical model, but our thinking is based on associations. If you've never seen a black pilot, you should be worried the first time you see one. And in the same way, if you've never seen a woman leader, you should be worried. Another effect of exposure, just 7 years exposure to women leaders was that the gap, this is the height of this bar is a measure of the gender gap in parents' aspirations for their sons rather than their daughters. And if you've been reserved twice, so you've had, at the time of data collection, 7 years of exposure, there is a lower gap than if you've been reserved once, so you are just 5 years, or never reserved, no years of exposure. So it seems like exposure, normalizing what would have been impossible, actually changes how you perceive women leaders and what you want for your own children. So one father is quoted as saying he wants his little girl to grow up to be a pradhan. But really there was no economic change. The likelihood your little girl is going to grow up to be a pradhan is the same likelihood as your son is going to be president. I mean, it could happen for your daughter, but it's not too likely. And it's not that the women leaders were better or worse. They didn't put in more schools or better teachers. It's just, it seems that even in the absence of fundamental economic change, there were real changes in how people saw the world and in what they wanted. And that gave rise to willingness to vote for women even after reservations were eliminated. So this graph shows the proportion of women elected as village heads after reservations in those villages ended. So these were free elections. And in free elections, 10% of the women in non-reserve villages, 10% of leaders were women in non-reserve villages. Reserved once, it was, I guess, 14, and reserved twice, I guess it was 18. So that means that you have an exogenous change in exposure, which seems to have changed perceptions and preferences, which then created a change in fundamentals. And it all happened because something in the brain changed. Second example, this is a picture of the Hajj. The Hajj is where people from over 100 countries get together and engage in the same rituals, wear the same clothes, and have a kind of spirit of equality and mixing. Some of them stay for as much as a month. In Pakistan, there's such a demand to go to Mecca to participate in the Hajj that the government has instituted a random lottery for selecting the winners of the visas. So that gives us a chance to do an RCT. So Michael Kremer and many co-authors studied the attitude 6 months after they came back from Mecca. And what does he find? He finds, well, okay, I have to give background. So what happened there is Pakistanis would see for the first time men and women interact relatively freely. And the sky did not fall. The women did not jump into bed with every man, and the men didn't take advantage of every woman. Malcolm X, when he decided to become a Muslim, went to Mecca, and for him too, it was a big eye-opener because he saw for the first time blacks and whites interacting in a fairly equal way. And living in the US at that time, he never would have seen that. And what I've seen, he writes, an experience has forced me to rearrange much of my thought patterns. You rearrange your thought patterns, then you rearrange your perceptions, you rearrange your worldviews. And that's a process that can give big attitude changes. So what Kremer and co-authors find is there's greater acceptance of female education and employment, more positive attitudes towards women's abilities, more concerned about crimes against women. Yet it's not as if the pilgrims, after they come back, do anything different. It's not as if they're elected to high office. And something that is consistent with the idea that it's exposure that's giving rise to the change in mindsets is that the effects were larger for people traveling in small groups. And if you're traveling in small groups, of course, you interact with others much more than you would if your whole village showed up at Mecca together. Example 3. So examples 3 and 4 are sort of the same. They're about TV. They're about exposure to soap operas. And the first example is for India, and the second is for Brazil. And this is not an RCT, but control variables are held, and I'll try to make a persuasive case that it's exposure to the soap operas that was driving the changes, not any factors that contributed to some villages getting cable and other villages not. So on cable, there was a very popular soap opera called Mothers-in-Law Were Daughters-in-Law Once Too, and it just showed urban Delhi women having, reasonably nice lives. It was fairly conservative, but the women talked back to their husbands. The husbands would beat the women could move in and out of the house freely, and they didn't have many children. So Judson and Oster divide their villages into 4 groups. The big area, which is really dark, has had cable for a very long time. The lightest color got cable in 2002. Then a slightly darker got cable in 2003. Where is the group that never had cable? I guess you can't even see it here because my color choice is so terrible. I guess this is had cable and this has never had cable, and then the action is these 2 lighter areas. So a number of questions. They asked the households number of situations in which beating is acceptable. So apparently a standard question is, if the wife burns the food, is beating acceptable? It's a good thing I'm not in one of these households. I'll just focus on these 2 and notice how there's no change between 2001 and 2003 in the households where there was no change in access to cable. But in the villages where there was a change in access to cable, it was exactly when they got cable in 2002 that you had a decline in the number of situations that were judged as justifying wife beating, and then a decline again the next year. Now this set of villages got cable only in 2003, and there the decline occurred in that year. The next question is, do you want your next child to be a boy? And again, there's no action where there's no change in access to cable, but exactly when cable comes in, son preference goes down. Exposure, this is about autonomy. So you ask about norms in the household. Are you allowed to decide how to spend your husband's income? Are you allowed to decide how to spend your own income? Do you need permission to visit your parents? Are you allowed to keep any money for yourself? And again, I mean, these results are unbelievable. it's exactly when you get cable that there's a jump in autonomy. I mean, these aren't major changes. You know, as usual, they kind of cheat in that, you know, this is very truncated. So it's not like you go, you know, from feudalism to post-Betty Friedan liberation. But recognize all that happened was you saw soap operas, so it seems like you are getting change out of nothing. And then fertility decline. So now let me go to the other soap opera example, which just focuses on fertility. So Ileana Laferrara and co-authors took advantage of the fact that it was a very small number of years, basically a decade between 80 and 90, when this monopolist producer of soap operas expanded across urban areas in Brazil. And they look, there's no survey here, they look at actual census data and fertility of the women. And they code each village as 0 in the year that the village, each town, each municipality is 0 in the period when the municipality got access to the soap operas. And on that basis, they plot the fertility for villages exactly 10 years before and 10 years after, and each year in between, they got coverage of this global set of soap operas. And the decline comes exactly when they get the coverage. And this is census data, so nobody could be doing, you know, like Joe's example of the pharmaceuticals who have clinical trials and they, you know, count the data that's on their side and supporting their hypothesis and discount the data that doesn't. This is census data, and it's real, comparable. This so the decline in fertility for women ages 35 to 44. So it's basically what happens is that women stop having kids earlier. It's not like 16-year-olds still don't have kids; they do, but women stop having kids earlier. And the amount is a decrease of 11% of the mean. And that is comparable to what you get with 2 years of women's education. So it's very, the fertility, so now the authors code every respondent as 0 or 1 according as that woman has an age which is within a interval not more than 4 years different from the age of at least one of the leads in an ongoing soap opera. So let's say I'm 15 and all the leads are 30, then I'd get a 0. Let's say all the leads are 30 and 26, 27, up to 34, I get a 1. Do you understand? You know, the sort of proximity. So when you get a 1, then the fertility decline effect is stronger, which is consistent with the idea that this is really a role model effect. You're seeing people who look like you and talk like you, they're not having as many children as you, they're clearly having better lives than you, and all of a sudden you think differently. Now I should add that there's something special about these Brazilian and Indian populations, and that is that there's an incredible level of illiteracy. So they're really being exposed for the first time to the outside world through soap operas. It's not as if they're going to the local library or even reading newspapers. So it's really a story of power of exposure.
Karla, do you have information on what was the composition of the samples in Brazil and in India? Or,
So in Brazil, they looked at the entire census.
okay, and then
In India, it was just the area that was covered by this survey, and I actually don't remember the details of that. I don't know the details of that.
Karla, there's a question.
Sorry, just a quick question. So there's census data from Brazil, but it seems to be annual data. So do they have annual
Absolutely. The
census?
census is certainly nowhere near annual. What they did is they have from the census all your children and the ages of all your children, and they painstakingly constructed a history. And then they even compared, in other words, if you in the census tell me that you have a 4-year-old, a 10-year-old, and a 20-year-old, I can, without too much difficulty, figure out when these kids were born. I can figure out how many children you have. And then they had some other source of data, and they actually compared, and they had something like a 99% right answer. So that's, yeah, it's an excellent question. I mean, that's why this paper really is an extraordinary paper, how, carefully they use the data to get, they only talk to you, I think it's a decennial data. I think it is once every 10-year census. And they reconstruct what you did each year for fertility just by looking. I mean, it was very, very creative. So I've now completed the first section of the talk, which is to say it seems like there is something we might call mental models that changes with exposure to new situations that normalize alternative ways of living that you didn't think could or would or should happen. The first example I gave you before I started this, the example of climate change and motivated cognition, was about how you can get more information and not change your mental model, and how smarter people are better at motivated cognition than dumber people, and which is very consistent with the kind of things you talked about. 2008, the financial collapse, and yet I can say, well, I knew it all the time, government failure, or who knows. Now I'm going to switch to lab studies that suggest we have multiple mental models about given phenomena, and I can switch the behavior or the attitudes of a person by cueing one or another. And we all know how susceptible we are to cues. If I start saying you don't drink a Coke, don't drink a Coke, you'll be dying for a Coke, whereas you didn't have any problem before. If I have ads about potato chips everywhere, you'll always, you'll be thinking about potato chips in a way that you wouldn't think otherwise. You ask people how many ships go through the Panama Canal. I think that's a question nobody in the world would really know the answer to. And if you first ask them to think about a particular number, that'll influence how many ships they think go through the Panama Canal. So we have you think your computer has limited random access memory. Individuals have really limited random access memory. Thank God. I mean, if you had to carry around, all of your social conflicts with you everywhere you went, I mean, that's a story of hell, I'd say. So it's a psychologically protective thing. But that means that, that really has an exciting result, exciting implication, and that is that the society you're in, which provides the context you're in, shapes what is salient, which shapes how you think, which then shapes how you behave, which then shapes the institution. And that's really the basic idea of social rigidity. And societies are much more stable than you might think. They don't go bang, bang when relative prices change. If I've always eaten cereal for breakfast, I'm always going to eat cereal for breakfast. A new study by David Aiken looks at the rice and wheat growing parts in India, and how if you leave the rice growing part, you'll still want to eat rice, and it will cost you in calories. So we don't reinvent ourselves, but context does matter a great deal. So just to put you in the mood, and among us entertainment, this is a standard optical illusion, and you're supposed to look at the two orange circles, and I'm supposed to ask you, are the two orange circles the same size?
Yes.
Oh, give a kid an education and see what happens. Okay, they don't look the same, but they are the same. And why do they look different? The reason they look different is because everything is relative, and all business people know that. They have a high-priced item next to the more reasonably priced item, and then the reasonably priced item looks like a great deal. So it's the frame that shapes your perception, and that's the idea I want to convey next. So frames are defined as observables that shouldn't matter, but do matter, because they trigger a particular way of thinking about a choice. And they determine what things are salient to you, or they might evoke a particular self-concept. So an example I like is about prisoners. So the authors went to Zurich. There are even prisoners in Zurich, not many, but there are some. And they had them fill out a survey. And in the control group, so they randomized prisoners into two groups. In the control group, they ask about what TV shows you like and what you like to eat and stuff like that. But they don't ask anything about how many people you killed or why you're in prison. And then they let you play a game where, and this is the kind of game that's being done now in many places to get information. It's a really clever game. I give you, let's say, 10 coins, and I say, in the privacy of this room, toss the coins, and if it's head, keep the money, and if it's tails, put the money back in the envelope and give it back to me. And obviously, you make more money if you say it's heads. And maybe you really did get 10 heads, you know? Maybe you're a lucky guy. But not everyone got 10 heads. If everyone claims he got 10 heads, I can compare this to the binomial distribution, and I can see what fraction of people cheat. So I think this is quite clever. And in the control group, as I said, no questions were asked in the survey about your prisoner identity, and people are reasonably honest. It's true that 10% or 12% of the people have all 10s. Black is what the prisoners reported, and white is the binomial distribution. So white obviously has a mean of 5, and there's very little chance that you got 100% tails or 100% heads. And there certainly was cheating. But still, you know, there were people who actually said, remember, black is what they reported, who actually said they only got 2 heads. Isn't that admirable? It's very admirable. And the people who said they had 9 heads were actually right in line with the binomial distribution. So yeah, there's shifting, but it's mostly the guys who just want to say they have 10. And other guys are really pretty honest. But now I look at what happened with the treatment group. The treatment group is just the same as the control group, except in their survey they were asked, why are they in prison? How do they like prison conditions? When are they going to get out of prison? Just one little module among many other modules about TV shows and other things. That made salient in their minds a fact that they obviously knew they're in prison, and now they're cheating more. So now, again, binomial is white, and what they reported is black. Nobody said he got 1. Nobody said he got only 2 heads. Very few, 3. And there were lots of 9s, 8s, and 7s. So either they became really lucky, or they cheated. Another example, well, I guess these are just a set of examples. I guess I didn't set this up in a very elegant way. Individuals are randomly assigned to fill out background questionnaires that prime one aspect or not of their identity, so it's similar to the Cohen study. And if I prime their Asian identity, Asian Americans are more patient, more cooperative. If I prime family-oriented identity, then they're more worried about their family. You know, so I have only one tiny picture of my daughter at work, because if it were right there, I'd be thinking, oh, I should be making cookies, you know? But if I have it just in the corner, I don't worry about it. Even the language of thought affects attitudes. So bilingual students are great, bilingual people are a great pool of subjects to do studies that look at the effect of priming language. There's now a lot of work on what is the effect of language on thought. Now, you can't do that with Americans who normally only speak one language, but most of the world speaks multiple languages, and so you can do studies where, for example, you have people speaking in one or another language for some time and taking what's called an implicit association test, a test of association in one language or another, and that will shift how positively they feel about, let's say, Moroccan identity versus French identity. They're more pro-French when they're speaking French, and they're more pro-Moroccan when they're speaking Arabic. A very recent study has students fill out a questionnaire about entrepreneurship for 45 minutes and then pays them for their efforts and time and asks them to contribute to charity. And they will shift their behavior in the direction of Muslim norms versus Western norms if they filled out the questionnaire in Arabic versus French. So again, it all goes back to the way we have limited random access memory, and we have activated those associations and those norms that are connected to one language when we're using that language, and another when we're using another set when we're using a different language. There's a study right now going on, so I'm waiting to hear the results, which look at how mothers who are bilingual interact with their kids. And somehow they randomize what language the mothers use. And the preliminary results seem to be that mothers treat their kids differently in one language than another. Is that funny? Okay, so now I've tried to set up the notion that you can get changes in behaviors without changes in fundamentals. And that the mechanism might be changes in perceptions, changes in self-construals, changes in preferences. And in particular, you might have multiple mental models that are primed by questionnaires or by language, and therefore more generally are primed by context. So I want to take that idea of the power of context to shape who you are to build the world's simplest model. And it's very much in the spirit of sociologists. So sociologists' critique of economics is that we're all very good at talking about how roads and bridges get built and how markets work, but we don't talk about the construction of the person. And the construction of the person is one of the most important things that gets constructed. For those of you who have children, that's one of the hardest things there is. Producing a kid that's not a complete crazy person. Well, maybe it was my bad genes. Maybe that was why I had such a struggle. If you recognize, if you take seriously the kinds of examples I've given you, then you have to recognize that it's not just that individuals are choosing their behaviors, which then produces the society, but then having in aggregate made their choices, that's a context which primes a particular way of thinking of yourself. So individuals do choose, like economic man, you do get an aggregate outcome, but that aggregate outcome then influences how people think and even how they perceive raw data. So this is a very non-neoclassical result, and it means, of course, there's pervasive externalities, not just in learning, but even in thinking. But the cultural cognition stuff suggests that that's exactly what happens. So, a simple model, continuum of agents, because economists like smooth functions, so that's why you have continuous agents. And we're going to call them parents. And they each have a daughter, and they make one decision. Do they educate the kid or not educate the kid? So if they don't educate the kid, they get utility theta. And if all of you are agents in this model, each of you will have one daughter, and that daughter will be a type. That type I call theta. And theta is different for different people. Some uneducated girls will bring their parents a lot of happiness, and some uneducated girls will bring their parents a lot of pain. And if yes, then the parents have two sources of utility from their daughter. One is income, which she shares with the parents, and it's market determined. Let's say every educated girl gets a call center job. Now, I realize in the real world we all have very different abilities and we'll get different incomes, or maybe we just have different willingness to work. Maybe that's really it. But in my story, just to make things simple, it would be not difficult to complicated, but there's no point. You're guaranteed a call center job, and that gives you a fixed income. You get $100 a week. But there is a level of intrinsic satisfaction from those dollars that's based on a social construction. So imagine that you had a choice. You could work as a stripper, or you could work at a drugstore. You get the same income from both, but being a stripper is certainly a lot less work, I would guess. And what are you going to do? A lot of people will go with the drugstore because they'll feel better about the money. $1 is not just $1. You might feel bad to be doing something that's stigmatized. In the same way, having a job, which means you go outside of the house and you actually interact with men, that could be highly stigmatized. in a highly patriarchal society in which women's autonomy is limited, it is stigmatized. You don't, I mean, I've even met Frenchmen who don't want their wives to work because they're just certain that if their wives work, well, I don't need to spell it out. You know, I mean, it's just an incredible mindset. You know, if the guy is horrible, she'll go out to the next door neighbor. She doesn't need to go to work. But they have this idea, and that's even, you know, that was in the 20th century. This was in the 1990s. And we have two mental models. One is that women's autonomy is a good thing, so you're proud of a free thinker. And the other is the patriarchal mental model, where you feel ashamed if the woman speaks up. And certainly I've had Indian women explain to me that from the day a daughter is born, it's explained to her that you eat second, you follow the husband, he is the chief. And people tend to naturalize whatever they see as being God ordained. And in the Supreme Court case in I think something like 1879 that cited an article by Cass Sunstein, the Supreme Court is denying the right of a woman to take the bar exam. And the court explains that this is just the law of God, and they're just acting on God's will. This is America. Less than, how many years ago? It was 1897. I guess 140 years ago. I call A and P the two different mental models, and clearly our parents' utility from an educated girl is higher under mental model A, where you're proud of someone who can think for herself, and lower, relatively, in the patriarchal. So what is your utility from educating your girl? Remember, you all get theta if you don't educate your daughters. If you educate your daughters, then you'll get some weighted sum of the utility under one mindset and under an alternative mindset. And W are just the weights, so they go between 1 and 0. And the higher is W, the higher is the weight on the autonomous mental model, which means the higher is the utility from educating your girl. S is the salience of the mental model, and obviously if it's more salient, if the mental model A is more salient, W goes up, and therefore the utility of an educated girl goes up. So obviously this is very, very reduced form, and I'm even somewhat ashamed of it, but it's similar to the utility model that Benjamin and others did in their AER paper on priming identity. So I figure if they can get away with it, I can get away with it. So now, what is equilibrium? Let's think about equilibrium. In equilibrium, the family is indifferent between educating the kid and not educating the kid. So there's some theta the family gets if the kid isn't educated, and then there's some utility that is a weighted sum of the A and the P that the family gets if the kid is educated. So for the marginal kid, those two things have to be equal. You're indifferent. And then everybody who has higher theta, no education. Everybody who has lower theta, education. So an interior equilibrium is the solution to two equations. There's a marginal kid who gets educated, and that marginal kid, if she weren't educated, would produce utility for the parents of theta star. And then associated with that theta star is, of course, a fraction of the population that got educated. Everybody with utility less than theta star does get educated. And I'm just going to make the assumption that the proportion of parents who educate their daughters is what determines salience. So this is just a way to get from micro to macro. All the parents are making decisions independently. The outcome of their decisions is a proportion of kids who are educated. That proportion of kids sets a tone, creates exposure, makes salient what it means to have an educated kid. You see that the whole social order does not collapse when women get educated. You see that they may even have something to contribute. They can read the instructions, how to get an Narega, or how to use a new seed or how to apply new medicine. So you might see what's good about it. Whereas if you've never seen an educated girl, you might maintain the assumption that it's simply unnatural for women to be educated. So these two equations can be represented as individual behavior is consistent with the environment, and the social environment is determined by individual behavior. Theta star is the marginal, is the cutoff between who gets educated and who doesn't. That determines by the CDF, the fraction who get educated. That determines the salience of educated women. That determines the weight on VA, and then that's consistent with the choices. So you can just put this in a picture. So in a picture, what you have is the more salient the mental model for autonomous women is, the more utility the parents get from an educated daughter. If the weight is 1, they get VA. If the weight is 0, they get VP. And then I just made it linear. But the point is it's upward sloping. That's all that matters. And theta is just an exogenous, exogenously distributed parameter. So this is the CDF. But I've switched the, normally f of theta would be on the y-axis and theta would be on the x, but it's convenient to switch. So I just drew it as a normal curve, but it could be anything. It's upwardly sloping. I mean, the one rule you learn about CDFs is they're always upwardly sloping. And now these are the two pictures. So if I take these two pictures, I can see that I have f of theta here and s there, and I've assumed that s equals f of theta, and therefore I can superimpose these two pictures, and that's my equilibrium. And you can see I can get, since they're both upwardly sloping, I can get multiple equilibria. This equilibrium will be unstable. Why will it be unstable? Here I'm indifferent. This is an equilibrium. I don't care if I educate my kid or not. The two utilities are the same. Utility from an uneducated and from an educated kid. But then suppose a few more people got educated. S went up. Now the utility from education is higher than the utility from not educating my kid, so I'm going to move in this direction. And similarly here, if I had an exogenous shift here, I'd find that the payoff from a non-educated kid is more than from an educated kid, so I'd move there. So that's how you can have a good equilibrium and a bad equilibrium, and then you can think about an exogenous change moving from the dash to the solid, and you can see that as it keeps moving up, you could totally eliminate the bad equilibrium. So you have the possibility that a small change in thinking, like exposure to soap operas, for example, that exogenously shifted the weight on the mental model A rather than P, would give rise to a big change in behavior. Whereas in the neoclassical model, your utility is your utility. It doesn't depend on the context. It's true, of course, economists recognize that Japanese people like sushi and Americans like hot dogs, but culture has nothing to do with the way you process information, how you conceptualize the good life. It has nothing to do with how you imagine the world playing out, and therefore there's no difference in the way the Japanese and the Americans process information, which is absolutely counter the fact. My favorite results on this, do you know this? So you show Asians and you show Americans aquaria, and there's a big fish and then there's a lot of little fish and some plant life. And then you show them the plant life or the big fish, or you show them the little parts. And that way you can see what they focused on and what they remember. The Americans remember the big fish, and the Asians remember the whole context. And oh, there's another really cute thing. It's called the framed line test. You give people a square in which there's a line, and then you ask them, and then you make a bigger square, and here's the test. Here you're supposed to reproduce this line in relative terms, relative to the frame, and here you're supposed to produce it in absolute terms, relative to the frame. So, let's do the absolute one first. I'm an American, so that's easier for me. See, I'm even giving away that I'm an American here. So absolute, it's this. So it's this. So that's the right answer. And relative, this is basically half. So that's the right answer. Do you understand? So, Hazel Marcus hooks people up to MRI machines while they're doing this. Now, there's some part of your brain you use for difficult problems, math problems, and another part of your brain that you use if it's really easy. The Asians use this part of the brain, that's usually part of the brain for math problems, to do absolute, whereas relative is really easy. And it's the reverse for Americans. Isn't that unbelievable? But it's really not unbelievable. So there was a nice exhibit in New York at the American Museum of Natural History on the brain a few years ago. Did you see that? It was really nice. And they had a picture of a real cross-section of a brain of a London taxi driver. There's a part of the brain called the hippocampus. I only learned this when I went to the exhibit. And the hippocampus does spatial orientation. I probably have a very small hippocampus. If you can survive as a London taxi driver, you have a big hippocampus. Those brains are different. And, you know, it's not really surprising. If you try to learn tennis, I've spent years trying to learn tennis. I don't think I'll ever be great. What you're doing is you're building up a muscle in your brain, in effect. You're building up a circuit that just knows when you toss the ball exactly how you're supposed to hit it. It's not the rational actor model. It's creating a heuristic. So the context, what we do, affects how we think. The context affects how we think. We are not these exogenous rational actors. We're actually very, very sensitive creatures, which has incredible evidence, let's say, for the development of a child and, you know, the problem of parenting. How you talk to a child when she's very young affects what kind of child that becomes. Because she gets certain circuits in her brain. If a child doesn't form close relationships when she's very young, she'll never develop those muscles. She'll never be able to be a good husband or a good parent or good anything because she won't develop those muscles. Anyway, what's interesting is that so the argument in the cultural psychology field, Hazel Marcus and others, is that in a society where you're always having to think about the context, then you're really good at thinking in relative terms. Whereas in a society which privileges the atomistic, rational actor type, well then you're very good at thinking in absolute terms. The ideology actually shapes who you become. So, the effect of opportunities in the neoclassical model is just to change allocation. But the effect of a change in opportunities in the model I've proposed is one in which not only do you change application, not only do you obviously reallocate when opportunities change, but your preferences actually change because your thinking changes. There's a sociologist at MIT called Sherry Turkle who writes very entertaining books about how the computer has changed the way we think about relationships. The computer, as soon as you make a command, it instantly responds. So now apparently we have a new generation of people who think, well, if I say something, you should automatically respond. In other words, they're not very good at relationships anymore because their standard of comparison has become a computer. So there's a complementary role between positive mental models and job opportunities. It's obviously not. So sometimes when I talk about mental models, people get very upset. They think, oh, so it's not important to build roads? It's not important to, have markets that produce a lot of job openings? What about China? People get very upset. It's obviously not that I'm saying we don't need the fundamentals to be right. It's just that getting the fundamentals right is not enough. We could have a mental model which is so perverse that we don't let our women out of the house, we don't let them get educated, we don't let them go into new jobs, and therefore call center companies facing a fixed cost to recruit in one village or another don't even go to the village. So a perverse mental model can stop development. And once development starts, there's probably a complementary relationship between new opportunities and new ways of thinking. And that entails a prediction. An exogenous change in recruiting services to young women get call center jobs should change how people think. So back to Rob Jensen. Rob Jensen was once in a hotel. And there was a convention in this hotel of call center recruiters. He was surrounded by these guys. And instead of thinking, oh, how annoying, everywhere I go are these call center recruiters, he thought to himself, this is an opportunity. So he gets to know these call center recruiters, and he hires some of them away from their regular jobs, and for him, they just work for 3 years. And they go to the villages he tells them to go to, and they do what he says they should do. And he picks villages that have never had call center recruiters, remote villages with very few educated women, where it simply wouldn't be profitable for call center recruiters to go.
This is in India.
In India. Yeah, yes, in India, I should have said that. And so now we have an RCT where some villages for 3 years have had recruiters and some villages have not. And before that, they've never had recruiters. So that means that parents, for the first time, are seeing that there are a few girls that actually get jobs with real money, nice jobs, not manual labor jobs. And you know, it's not a big deal. There aren't many educated women, and it's not like there are 100 call center recruiters. Only 4.6 percentage points increase in probability that a girl gets work in a call center in his treatment villages, which is a trivial wealth effect. But obviously parents now see that their daughters could conceivably get these jobs, just like in the Beeman et al., you saw that a woman could conceivably be a village leader. And they seem to see their daughters differently. For young girls, 30 to 40% of the body mass index gap with wealthy Delhi residents is closed. Parents are feeding their little girls better after the exposure to call center recruiters and to women getting these jobs than before. And this, Jensen argues, is too large a change to be plausibly explained with fixed preferences. So you know, you can't prove that this changed their preferences, but it's suggestive. Summary. So there seems a lot of evidence, you know, particularly from the lab studies in psychology of this kind, or the lab studies where, you know, I ask you to look at your social security number, and if it ends with 2 big digits, you know, you're very generous with what you'll pay, and if it ends with 2 small digits, you're very ungenerous. That's the Ariely predictively irrational. This is really cute. He has these, in the book Predictively Irrational, he has these computer-generated pictures, and you know, so there'll be some guy, and then there'll be, so call him A, and then there's A prime, and he's just like A, except you know, his nose is in the wrong place. Let's say his nose is too low. And then there'll be some very different looking kind of guy. Let's give him funny hair. And you ask people, who do they want to go out with? And if it's A prime, and B, they tend to want to go out with A. But then, if he does a B prime, where B is just like that, except one hair sticks out or something, so there's B prime, and A, then everybody wants to go out with B. Why is that? Business people all know this. You never focus on all the features of a thing. You focus on those features that are salient. What's salient is what's different between that and what you're comparing it to. You ask people where they want to go on a trip, and you can manipulate where they want to go simply by making salient that you get free coffee in one place and you don't get free coffee in another place. Except, you know, whether you should go to Paris or London really should not be affected by whether you get free coffee. It's just that life is so complicated, it's so much trouble to think about all the features. At a certain point, you just want to decide. And you decide, automatically, unconsciously, by focusing on those things that are salient, and a slight difference between this and the alternative will make one thing salient or another. So all of these psychology studies, and then this power of the example study, suggest that we really do have mental models that exist prior to perceptions and that shape perceptions, and the power of the example is that it actually affects choices relevant to development. And we even develop cognitive commitments to our mental models. You know, we love our pets, we love our children, we even love our mental models. So we tend to discount data that is inconsistent. So that's presumably the story of economists. It's certainly the story of the climate change example I gave you at the beginning. But if we really engage with alternative mindsets, alternative social roles, alternative ways of living, it'll weaken the hold of these commitments, it'll normalize the impossible, and what that means is there's scope for new kind of behavioral interventions to change mental models. And there are social multipliers. If other people start behaving differently, it affects my beliefs, which of course affects the salience of one view or another, which affects my utility, which affects my behavior. So there are very diffuse externalities when society constructs people. So does that mean we should all become sociologists? No. I was once at a meeting with sociology. I think in the end they didn't like me very much. I talked a lot about equilibrium. And you know, they said they never talked about equilibrium. And they didn't think they needed equilibrium. They didn't want to talk about equilibrium. It was the strangest thing. I think that economics has, the best tools of any social science for thinking about stability and change. But I think that other social sciences, and now neuroscience, have the best tools for thinking about how people think. And that suggests one can make a marriage between the insights of non-econ social sciences and economics, and think about social change and social rigidity as influenced, as putting it on a cognitive basis, is influenced by these deviations from rationality that the other social sciences think about. So I think I'll end right there.
I found the examples fascinating, particularly the one about the soap opera and the effect on kind of gender perception and all of that. And I was just thinking about, the power of the example is quite visible there. And then there's the question also where the content of the example comes from, or the origin. So for the US, for example, there's a really good documentary on the role of women in media, showing that actually during the last decade or so, women were sexualized through movies, through adverts, through all of that. And they go back and kind of into
The public space is very unequally distributed. If you're not a movie director, no one else directed movies. There are some women, but of course it is a male-dominated profession. Just as law is a male-dominated profession, or at least historically was a male-dominated profession, and that does shape the evolution of society as well, and really I think tightens the screws. So it's not just that the example society shows up affects what's salient, which affects the mental model that's activated, which affects the utility, which affects what you do, which can reproduce society. But it's also that those who are privileged by the social structure get to fill more of the public space than those who are not. And there's no accident as to why historically low-caste people were not allowed to get an education and blacks were not allowed to get an education. You want to silence those people. So it's even worse. And I think that's a good point. And I think someone could build a model where he had that additional influence of a social structure on the mental models. Yeah. Yeah.
Rod used his hand first.
Oh, I'm sorry.
There's just to flag sort of a body of literature that may be interesting. Beth Simmons at Harvard and a variety of other political scientists have attempted to apply, I would say in somewhat of a questionable way, but in an interesting way, some of these, to try to sort of test hypotheses of sort of behavioral and learning changes at the country level against sort of other explanations for things like policy diffusion. So there was sort of a large study of looking at sort of what are the conditions under which countries sign investment treaties, and they sort of contrasted sort of some hypotheses that relate more to sort of rational choice that sort of countries sign based on sort of a competition for capital, There was a hypothesis related to coercion, which is sort of, is it rich countries forcing this on poor countries? And then sort of one related more to learning, looking at sort of a lagged effect of sort of, whether these attract investment or not over time might lead to more signing of treaties down the line. And I think this kind of exercise is problematic for a whole variety of reasons, and the way that they operationalize these variables is also very problematic. But one of the things that they found was that sort of learning was the least, learning and behavioral change was sort of the least significant impact. So I don't know. I mean, I would just be interested if in any of your investigations here, did you, you sort of commented that sort of how economics has a toolkit that leads it to have, perhaps useful conclusions about equilibrium, stability, and change. And there's sort of these behavioral, more cognitive sciences that really help us get inside the mind of the individual. Did you find anything that sort of attempted to scale up this from sort of the mind of the individual to sort of the mastermind of larger entities like states or firms?
Well, the mastermind, there's no mastermind, there's no political elite, there's whoever is holding power. There's a lot of interest in connection with the WDR that we look at mental models of policymakers. And we are conducting in 6 countries a survey and some small experiments to try to get at biases of policymakers. And obviously, that's one of the things I think that Joe emphasizes in everything he does. Would you agree that policymakers seem to be wedded to certain mental models, and depending upon where you stand, you can interpret anything as proving that C, governments fail, or C, markets fail. There's no mastermind. I mean, I certainly don't believe in conspiracy theories, but on the other hand, outcomes often look as if they were forged by conspiracy, because you get such damaging views. Somebody the other day, I can't remember who, talked about the autism. Some guy has some really stupid idea about autism, and even today, parents are not giving kids vaccinations for measles. Bad ideas do have a hold on us. I'll look into Beth Simmons. I don't know her work.
I mean, taking it from where Bob left off, I mean, framing another example of framing effects in economics, particularly in the policy realm, would be the Millennium Development Goals and how that's come to be like this gold standard in global policy development discourse, where you have these very radical goals such as elimination of gender inequality, but then framed against these targets and indicators that are extremely narrow, such as the elimination of just education inequality, and then that is seen as being elimination of gender inequality per se, and not any, a plethora of other inequalities and other dimensions. The other comment and kind of question, a bit of a quibble that I had, and I may be opening a bit of a Pandora's box here, is the framing effects that arise from the way economics literature, particularly the results of RCTs and the way they are presented itself. Like, say for instance, I haven't read the papers the results of which you presented, the one to do with Hajj to Mecca and impact on Pakistani male attitudes, or the impacts of soap opera on rural men and women, particularly on rural male attitudes. But not having a sense of the sample.
Mine was women's attitudes. The soap operas, the Jensen Oster is just looking at women's attitudes.
Okay.
Actually. And then the La Ferrara is just looking at fertility.
Okay.
And the Hajj is looking at attitudes of both men and women.
Of both men and women. I think it's important to kind of get a sense of who is also going and what kind of men and women that you're talking about. Because if it's presented in terms of an entire national identity, it takes away from the diversity in attitudes that are prevalent in a country context. And I know the educated elite in, say, Islamabad or Lahore and Karachi would have very different attitudes from people in Swan in like northwestern Pakistan that border Afghanistan. Or even in India, like, yes, I mean, it's horribly repressive. We have these deeply entrenched patriarchal attitudes, but you also have a growing minority of urban educated men who have been at the forefront of trying to change attitudes and who are extremely present in some of the protests around his horrible spate of violence against women. But when we have this literature in an attempt to be rigorous and look at the specific effects, you find, I feel it's important to be careful as social scientists as how those results are presented in order to avoid misinterpretation or these sweeping generalizations which don't serve us very well.
Right. I mean, I think that's so true, and I probably wasn't careful enough. I mean, this isn't a random sample of the world. It's not a random sample of Pakistan. It's the way I described it, and one always wants to know what is special about that population and this is the externality question. I can starve rats, and I can get rats to do certain things in response to incentives when they're just starving. Whereas you take normal people, presumably we're not going to put in that high stress situation, and they might be acting totally differently. One of the, I think, real kinds of progress in the sort of stuff I was describing in cultural psychology is that they are trying to get subjects from all over the world, from villages and urban areas, from very simple societies to modern societies, and seeing that not everything we thought generalized does generalize. And maybe there's something special about people who go to Mecca, that they're much more susceptible to influence. Maybe there's something special about Jensen and Oster's study. I don't think there's anything special about La Ferrara's study, because that was based on the census. Everyone's included. But I think it's true. You need to flag more carefully how special, what is the external validity.
Probably related to this. I'm just wondering, those case studies and the title of your talk, give the impression, is it that easy to orchestrate culture?
Yeah.
And if it is that easy, it sort of tempers a lot of pessimism that was there in, say, Professor Carlin's talk yesterday. Volkswagen may indeed come to south of Italy one day, if you would orchestrate the culture.
Is it that easy to change culture? Okay, so basically, the short answer is no. It's unbelievably difficult to change culture. What is often remarkable is you take somebody from some, very exotic culture, and you put him in America, especially if he's, not 85, but let's say he goes to college, and after 4 years, the guy becomes an American. It's the power of context. I think the reason culture is so hard to change is that I can't individually take each person from Afghanistan and put him in some, more liberal community. Were I to send him back, he'd probably get killed. You can't. It's this problem of size. I think I can change virtually any individual. I don't think that I can change any society. I think it's extremely difficult to change societies. And so this stuff is a little misleading. It does make it sound easy. And yet, people, it's not an accident that there are these 2 major studies on soap operas. People have noticed that fertility is going down without any real change in technology or massive increase in job opportunities that seems to explain it. And people have been saying for decades it was the soap operas. Soap operas are a really big thing because it took people who were closeted in their villages or even in their homes and illiterate, and then it brought in the whole world. This is not something you can do every day. And apart from cultural change being very difficult, there's a different question that in the WDR I'll have to face, though I really have no particular insight into it, and that is, who is an outsider to say what somebody else's culture should be? Should I tell you shouldn't be wearing purple shirts and you really should wear a yellow shirt? What is the welfare function? If you have multiple selves that are activated by context, how can I possibly say, one thing is a Pareto improvement over another thing? once you have a new situation, you have a new set of people, you have a new set of preferences. So what can you say? Well, I've been in rooms where this kind of thing came up, and Amartya Sen was present in one of these, and he said it was no problem. You just focus on the capabilities. It's clearly better that people die later and have a higher quality of life. It's clearly better that there's low infant mortality. It's clearly better that more people have access to education. So just try to focus on the basics. But of course, you can't just dissect and segment. You know, a lot of things come with education that some people would think are bad. Family ties might be weakened, for example. That's an unmitigated bad. There are many very unhappy people in the United States who are very cut off. When they die, no one goes to their funeral, which means their lives aren't very nice either. You know, these are quite difficult issues, and all I want to do is avoid sounding like an imperialist, a cultural imperialist, and I don't know if I'll succeed. Yeah.
Just to complicate things a little bit, I read this article in the New York Times that was saying that mother-in-laws in India control the TV remotes, and the creators of soap operas know that. And so they design their shows to portray mother-in-laws sympathetically. Yeah, so the point is that there's a feedback between this measure that could affect society and the state of society itself.
And that's very, very related, I think, to your point. What you're exposed to depends on what the gender of the director is and so on. Actually, Hollywood was very interested in gays. There were a lot of gay actors. They were pretty sick of being in the closet. I'm told, though I haven't seen this written up, that Hollywood made a decision, let's have shows portraying gays as nice people. And that had an impact on the unbelievably rapid shift in removing the stigma from being gay. Now, actually, it's very fashionable to be gay. My sister works in a firm where there are two women heads, and people all assume that it's a gay couple, and she says she lets them because it's so fashionable. You know, let people assume the best. 50 years ago, you would have been locked up. Oscar Wilde, do you know who Oscar Wilde is? He went to prison for 3 years. You know, this is not so long ago. But yeah, your point is the messages that get out, that's endogenous too. And I didn't know this about mothers-in-law, but obviously I did know that the underclass doesn't get educated.
There's a recent paper that just you might also find interesting that, and I'm forgetting who did it, but it was basically studying the role of the introduction of a reality TV show in the U.S. I think it's called like Babies Having Babies, or Teenagers Having Babies.
Oh, I've heard about it. It's
Yeah,
supposed to
yeah.
be disgusting. I
Yeah,
haven't
yeah.
seen it, but I heard it.
But they looked at sort of media you know, areas, counties or whatever, that had access to the show and that didn't have access
Oh,
to the
that's
show.
great.
And they found that this was the single biggest determinant of reductions in teenage pregnancy.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Who wrote this study?
I have to look it up, I forget, but it was recent. It may not even be published yet, but yeah.
Okay, well, I mean, for the WDR, we're very interested in the working papers, and that's the kind of thing I wouldn't know. I mean, you kind of have to know somebody to know
Yeah.
what the working papers are. And truly, if you think you have a great study, or you've written a great study, you can send it to me. And yeah, mark it urgent, because see, I won't know your name. And believe it or not, in my position, you know, I get really too many emails, so I can't process them. But I always look at my urgent ones. But that's really fun. Yeah, it's, you know, 14-year-olds having babies in this reality show, and then you see how their lives just turn into garbage temporarily. And you know, because America isn't set up to support this. I mean, maybe it works in some places, but it just doesn't work in America. And then
Well, the sad thing is, it goes around.
I think there was one more question in the back, actually.
As an apprentice. There's a replication
Oh.
of the show.
did you have a comment?
Well, I was wondering your example, the power of example to shift mental models. I was wondering to what extent are we certain that the mental model has shifted? Isn't there another layer to the mental model whereby the discriminatory practices actually go underground, and so all the more harder to detect, rather than a shift in the mental model actually? Is a question that has been actually troubling me for quite some time. And second, more of a comment, is, I mean, we who work in the area of meaning constantly keep asking ourselves, where is this meaning, is this meaning? And context is not the only source of meaning. Actually, the previous experience and the expectation of the participant also contribute to meaning. And therefore, these also have influence on the priming evidences.
Sure, it's not just context. I didn't mean to say it was just context. I just wanted to put that in as one missing variable. There are lots of variables. Some people argue that remote history of your group even matters. Nathan Nunn argues that attitudes towards women are partly shaped by whether you come from an ethnic group that historically used the plow or didn't use the plow, because associated with plow use is a more gendered segregation of occupational roles, since only men have the upper body strength to use the plow, whereas if you're just gathering berries, men and women are equally good at doing that. So, of course, experience is incredibly important. I just wanted to focus on one thing. And then to pick up a comment that you made, Elizabeth Beasley and Jan Algon and a bunch of Montreal psychologists have a working paper where they look at one-by-one intervention. So this is a case where Montreal had teachers identify the 25% most disruptive boys in the kindergarten class. And this was poor neighborhoods, so disruptive boys generally associated with really bad parenting and really bad neighborhoods. And there were just 19 sessions, 19, I think, 2-hour sessions over the course of 2 years with these boys, exposing them to pro-social boys, who, playing nicely with pro-social boys, and telling them, oh, if you're really upset, count to 10 before you do anything. Or if somebody doesn't play tag with you, recognize that it might not be personal. Look at it from the other point of view. In other words, they just learn certain social skills and they learn sort of a new theory of mind. Not everybody's trying to hurt them. Some people are cooperative. And they do this on an individual level. They don't change the whole society. They don't go into the slums or anything. But individually, these kids play with pro-social boys. And then, when they're 28, all this data is collected. And this went on for a really long time. When Jan Algon discovered the data these Montreal psychologists had, I mean, he was just so thrilled. Then he got his PhD student, Elizabeth Beasley, to do the real work of figuring out what was useful. And in their paper, they showed that participation in this program compared to being in the treatment group, because it was in the control group, because it was randomized, is associated with double-digit declines in the likelihood of being incarcerated, in the likelihood of flunking out of high school, and double-digit increases in the likelihood of being employed, but no increase in intelligence. So it's not like by staying in school you got smarter. It's just that you got the high school degree, you got a job, you didn't get into so much trouble. So you can change people individually. But changing whole societies, that's, obviously that's and who am I? Really I'm just presenting ideas that seem interesting, and exactly what the policy implications are, I don't even know. I didn't know. I don't want, we're not in the world of Big Brother, so it's not clear. But I think recognizing that people, just like societies are constructed, is a useful perspective that's missing in most of economics. So, should we end it here? Well, thank you very much.